couple of years ago, I went to an interrogation workshop run by Will Hunt. I was kind of fascinated by it because in kink, you get this almost playful exploration of some of the worst things that can happen to us. Bondage, impact play, things like this. These are nightmarish in real life, but to have them explored in a safe way is fascinating. These days, Will teaches regularly with his partner Louise, and I wanted to talk to them both, so let's have a look.
People have an idea that interrogation is, shouting in a German accent while electrocuting someone's genitals. It's all very kind of hammy, almost. I think people's idea of it, it's like shouting across a table, good cop, bad cop, that kind of stuff. I think people are always a bit surprised about how an interrogation workshop actually works. It's a lot more psychological. One of the big distinctions between interrogation and torture is torture, effectively, someone will say anything because you're hurting them badly enough. So all that torture can do, all that can achieve is to confirm a pre-held supposition. So effectively, people will just tell you what you want to hear. And if that was what we were doing, then every workshop would simply consist of kicking someone in the genitals repeatedly until they say, effectively, the safe word. An interrogation is about leading someone to a point where psychologically they no longer wish to resist. And effectively, in the two scenarios of either true confession or false confession, one is that they no longer wish to not tell you what you want to know. So the authority and the relationship has shifted so much to the point that they value what you are telling them to value more than they value resistance. Or in the case of false confession, is one where they've reached a psychological point where they are no longer able to resist replacing their known reality with your dictated reality. So they can't kind of go, that's not true anymore, because you've created an environment in which the only truth is the truth you are telling them is true, to the point where you have them invest and commit to it. And so it's quite different to what a lot of people think it is. There's not a lot of violence or physicality to it. It's a lot more psychological.
An interrogation scene isn't just that scene at that particular moment. There is a lot of build-up and tension building weeks beforehand, before the scene even takes place. So we artificially create that tension to a point where when it comes to the scene, it can almost explode, as it were.
Common misconception of the idea that in a real world scenario, someone's just kind of snapped off the street with no expectation and they're just whisked away to some terrible place. One of the more effective methods actually was to let someone know that they were going to be picked up off the street. Is you create a inevitability of it and a growing dread that they know it's going to happen at some point. And so you're allowing someone to start working against themselves, to start getting stressed, to start getting tense, to start imagining what can happen, to start worrying about it. And you actively feed into that in advance of anything actually happening. And so in that way, the scene happens, as I said, potentially weeks before the actual scene. And you create a narrative very carefully that constantly kind of ratchets up this kind of stress and this worry and this kind of panic almost that builds and builds and builds and builds, so that when you get to that point and you kind of prick it, it's allowed to kind of just burst forth and be so much more under this still surface perhaps, but this tension has been building under that.
I'm a masochist, both physically and mentally. I enjoy the release that comes from having my mind played with and broken. It's just another way for me to get that masochistic hit. There's also an incredible release of kind of like adrenaline that rushes through, and it is almost a high that comes with it. I know people that kind of enjoy it because they like the playing with the resistance and, oh, I want to see how long I can last before I kind of break and cave in. I know that can be really enjoyable for some people as well. I just like being broken.
From a top perspective, it can be satisfying on two levels, sadistic or just dominant. In a way, interrogation works as a psychological scalpel where you're effectively cutting through to the most vulnerable parts of a person and exploring them and allowing them to explore it as well, effectively to learn what triggers them, what gets to them. And so from a sadistic perspective, it's about the ability to cause somebody pain that is so much more extreme than pure physicality. So if you slap someone across the face, then, you're playing with someone, you slap them across the face. It's just a slap across the face, depending on how hard you hit them, is how much it hurts. If you have worked on someone and got someone worked up, and you've worked on them in a scene, in an interrogation, you've been yelling at them, you've been working with them, you've getting them worked up, and then you slap them across the face, the hit might be far less than you would normally be able to slap them, and they'd be fine with it, and it'd be part of the scene. The actual force can be far, far less. But because you've worked them up to such an extreme degree, the result is so much higher. And so in a way, we are vicariously enjoying and engaging with that sensation aspect. And so the hit for the sadist can be so much higher, while at the same time, the risk and actual kind of physical damage to the bottom is way lower. So you can actually do, in a way, things that cause a far greater reaction, a far strong kind of emotional reaction with far less physical risk. And so in that way, it's the kind of vicarious, kind of empathetic nature of the sadist. You can enjoy something that's a much more kind of a pure, extreme, emotional kind of satisfaction. And so from a sadistic perspective, that's what you can enjoy. You can also enjoy that wind up of not doing anything yet, but seeing someone get more distressed and be in more mental, psychological distress than physical. And so in a way, it's a different way of having a more extreme journey. I have a very interesting background involving working in various parts of the world. A lot of my work previously has been in hostile environment zones, and because of that, you have things which can be HET, for example, which is hostile environment training. You effectively get practiced at the risk that you are going to be kidnapped, or effectively you get run through these scenarios so that you know how to deal with them. And that, combined with my upbringing in Eastern Europe and the kind of friends I had, meant that I had access to a vast swathe of kind of formal and informal information and experience about what an interrogation is, what torture is, what techniques are used historically and currently. And so effectively, I was in a very odd position of being able to explore these from a kink perspective as well. And so be able to ground this play in very real techniques and psychology, which are effectively what we use. We're using methodologies that are used, but we're using them very consciously. One of the techniques that we use, for example, is effectively a discredited system of interrogation used by various police forces, which is discredited because of the amount of false confessions that would elicit through no kind of physicality, but through psychological distress. And so effectively it was so good at getting people to confess, they thought it was wonderful until they realised that people were confessing who hadn't done it, who literally could not have done it, but they were giving false confessions. And so in a practical sense, oh yeah, well, we can't use that then because it's not reliable, it doesn't actually provide us what we needed. But from a kink perspective, it's great because we can use it because our objectives are different. And so by taking some of these very real world skill sets and applying them in a conscious kink dynamic, we're able to engage in very realistic play. And I think that's a big part of it. A lot of kink is about suspension of disbelief. And so by using methods which are designed to psychologically unbalance someone and effectively get them to commit to the reality of the situation, we can take this kind of play to very real states.
Hello, I hope you like the video so far. We put out multiple videos a week across multiple platforms. If you want to support us, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to us on whatever social media platform you're using, and to like and comment on our videos. See you soon.
We bring real things into play quite a bit. You see people who explore potentially, like some people explore past traumas within controlled play environments as a way of gaining control over things they didn't have control over. So for me, I was seeing these things, learning about these things, and realizing that effectively there were types of play that people were doing in the kink setting, which I saw kind of interesting reflections of in real environments as well. And a good few years back, you had this weird obsession on the scene about waterboarding, because basically it came out about all the stuff that was happening in the real world, and then suddenly everyone was like, oh, it's so intense, and you had people basically trying to be as edgy as possible. And that was one of the things that actually inspired me to teach the first workshop, because I actually thought to myself, okay, people are trying to effectively kink certain activities, but they're taking the worst parts of them and the most dangerous parts of them. And so it's one of the things I explicitly state is that I don't teach waterboarding. I discourage it because people don't appreciate what it actually is and the risk involved. What I can teach are the psychological methods used to elicit useful information, or on the other side of it, to elicit false confession. And so I think a lot of it was reaction to that, as I saw people wanting to try a thing, not really having anyone to show them how to do it though, because it was a very odd series of events and combinations of circumstances that led me to being in a position where I had access to the actual information and experience enough with it that I felt I could pass that on safely. And then a great deal of research on top of that and structuring to try and turn it into a useful workshop.
It's never explicitly said, this is the end of it. It's always kind of, you've told me what I want to know. All these techniques that are used, they are designed to make you feel guilty, terrible, you're an awful person, you're hiding something. That can be incredibly tough. So having that kind of explicit, it's okay, you're not terrible, directly at the end of the scene is a small transition to start coming out of that guilty, horrible headspace that can sometimes come with that.
Yeah, you kind of want to almost walk backwards along the same route that you took to get there. And so talking about, for example, that, it's not your fault. You're a good girl. I'm the one who did this, not you. Because a lot of the techniques we'll use will be guilt displacement, that kind of along the lines of, I just want to go home, I don't want to be doing this, the reason this is still happening is because you won't just tell me the truth. And that kind of psychology of this is your fault, this is you that's making this happen. So this helpless empowerment and guilt is when you effectively walk back. So you explicitly relate to it and you talk it back and you reiterate that, this wasn't you, this was me, etc., etc. And so you're kind of, as I said, you're walking back along the same path you took, unpicking what you put in place. And just give yourself plenty of time to do that.
It takes a lot out of you. I'm often on the floor sobbing, quite often at a point where I can't really talk because of your body has just gone through cycles of so many different chemicals being thrown about that at the end of it, it is almost a crash. And it takes quite a while to become 100% again. Quite often we have 24-hour recovery aftercare set aside specifically because of how extreme it can be.
Definitely something worth highlighting is that even with significant aftercare, you've got to be aware there may be things that you don't expect that will have to be dealt with as well. And you always try and go in with best possible awareness, with a strategy for aftercare, with also an acceptance there may be things that you don't expect that will crop up and you need to adapt and deal with them. one of the common things I try and teach is that if you're in the middle of an interrogation scene and you have a great idea, it's not a great idea. This is not improvised. There is literally a roadmap of how you do this that works for 95% of people. You have your ABC of how you do this, how you progress it, step by step by step. There's almost this satisfaction of a plan having worked. And while you may use different angles and different tools to achieve that, the satisfaction is in knowing that you have followed through on a plan and you've picked a person apart. And there is a satisfaction in that, having power over someone in that way. And having spent your time, your work, kind of getting this all together and making it happen and it working.
We don't do it very often because of the amount of kind of work it takes afterwards to put someone back together again, for lack of a better phrase. But, you know, even being 24/7, we do still communicate if there's specific types of play we want to do, especially things that do take up that larger setup point. Like, for instance, with interrogation play, you need something where you're not going to alarm people into calling police, because whilst it's not very physical, it's very loud. You know, you're slamming tables, you're shouting, people, you know, you end up screaming even if it's kind of like not due to physical things. So, you know, there's the practical elements of ensuring you've got the right space to do it and the right equipment, but there's also the psychological aspect. So if I'm in a really bad mental health space, then an interrogation scene is definitely not something to go with. And obviously there's outside factors, so, you know, if someone's got an ill family member or their dog just died, you're not going to go into something like an interrogation scene because, oh boy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the bottom's got to be in a good place and the top's got to have had time to put it together as well. It's not a case of, let's do some rope this evening, great, we've got to set up the frame. It's kind of, we want to do an interrogation, okay, then we need a location, we need time, we need a set amount of time for aftercare as well. I need time to get everything ready. So it is far more, you plan for it and you try and get everything lined up and be aware that that won't always work, and that's okay as well. But yeah, it is the kind of place where you need a place where you can be loud. You need a weekend, so you've got a day to recover. You've got to put the work in to create the environment and to make it safe and to make sure both parties are in positions mentally where they're ready for it as well. It's a bit of a tricky one because it's not like there are books on it or lots of people doing workshops on it. We teach our practical in-person workshop twice a year. That's it. We don't do it more than twice a year because of the amount of time and work involved. To give you an idea of that, that's an 8-hour workshop that is full on, and that is literally an introduction. There is a lot going on here that you want to be as aware as possible. And there, as I said, there is a strategy, there's an ABC. So it's no good if you like see a movie when they were hitting someone and then you try and copy that. No, it's kind of like you can't just learn C and then just do C, because it doesn't work unless you've got the build up to it as well and you understand how that works. Your best bet would be looking for original primary resources. There are a range of declassified documents that are available online. So you're looking for actual documentation on actual methodologies if you've got the stomach for it. Otherwise, you want to be looking for people who are kinky, who have been through first-hand experience and training. Again, het stuff, for example. And you're far better going with original material converted to kink rather than kinky people trying to copy stuff they've seen.
Thanks again to Will and Louise for helping with this video. I highly recommend checking out their other videos. They go into a lot of detail as to how they integrate BDSM into their lives, and it is fascinating how they create a sense of harmony on an ongoing regular basis. Really interesting contrast in how they approach play differently from their relationship versus these one-off interrogation sessions. See you soon.